Thanks, everyone. For the benefit of anyone who's just listening to the recording and missed the introduction, I'm Dr. Liza Anderson. I teach church history and ascetical theology at General Theological Seminary. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a current book project I'm working on called Gathering Up the Crumbs, Eucharistic Theology and Spirituality in the Wake of the Pandemic. And realistically, what's probably going to happen is that you're going to be hearing about one chapter of that book, but because I'm a person who over-prepares, I've brought all my notes for the first 4 chapters. So if we get through chapter 1, don't worry, there's more. But realistically, I decided that I would prefer to do a deeper dive into one particular area of thought and theology, rather than try to give you the overview of all the things at a really high level. And the reason for this book is that the Eucharist has always been really central to my own self-understanding as a Christian. I converted to Christianity as an undergraduate when I was studying abroad in Egypt. And at the time, I was majoring in religion. So I would go to all kinds of religious services just for fun. It's just what you do. But I wasn't really looking to encounter God at any of that, right? I would sort of go notebook and pen in hand, ask critical questions. The Coptic Pope would give weekly sermons on Wednesdays, followed by a question and answer session, which is very dangerous if I'm in the congregation. And so I would go, I would ask, I would argue, but I wasn't necessarily looking to have like a direct encounter with God. And what actually happened is that I felt like I had a close encounter with God in the Eucharist. And not even by receiving the Eucharist, but what they did there with those who were not baptized and were going up for a blessing at communion is that the priest would bless them with the consecrated host. So the priest would hold the bread between 2 fingers and bless the person who was coming up for communion. And I basically really felt like I had a close encounter with God under the form of bread. And that was very confusing to me. And it was like, no, that's not how gods work. That's not how anything works. It's like, I'm a religion major. I understand God. I understand matter. God doesn't belong in matter. And what I really had to then spend the next subsequent years of my life working out is how to make sense of that experience. And, if we accept the idea that God could become present in bread, could God not become present in a human being, Jesus of Nazareth? But I really started from the Eucharist and worked backwards. And for most of my adult life then as a Christian, I actually had the privilege and the benefit of being in communities that offer daily Eucharist. I've lived in several monastic communities. I've spent a lot of my time in seminaries. And then I've also tended to be a part of, very high church Anglo-Catholic parishes that, of course, offer daily Mass. And so for most of my life as a Christian, I've been going to Eucharist every day. And then we had a pandemic. And the congregation that I was part of really just completely shut down for a year and a half and told us to just watch the National Cathedral. And then even for the year after that, I was living alongside Roman Catholic monks in a pretty rural part of the country and didn't have any access to Episcopal worship, even though I was surrounded by the Eucharist. And although this was in many ways a difficult stretch of time in my spiritual life, and I don't want to sort of glamorize it, I actually think it would be fair to say that I did more thinking and praying about the Eucharist during this very long stretch of time when I was without it than I had in 16 years as a daily communicant. And so the genesis of this book project has really been in my own thinking, praying on the Eucharist during a long stretch of time during which I haven't had access to it. So the first chapter that I want to talk to you about, which may turn out to be the only chapter you'd like to hear about, is one called Manna in the Desert. And this is about the role of desire in the Christian life. I want to argue that the Christian life is about the education of desire. It's not about the repression of desire. It's not about the elimination of desire, which makes it a bit different from some other religious and philosophical systems. But it's really about the training of desire, because our desires are what shape us. They draw us out of ourselves in the direction of something. And it's specifically the Eucharist that's one of the main tools for that. The Bible often compares the Eucharist to the manna that the people of Israel received in the desert, particularly in John chapter 6, but also in Hebrews, Revelation. And it's worth asking why. Is it just that they're both bread? Manna's bread, Eucharist is bread. Stop overthinking this, Liza. It's really just that they're both bread. Or is there something more complex going on there? What exactly did they think this manna was? How did manna work? What did it mean to say that the Eucharist is like manna? Well, I want to draw your attention to a passage in the Book of Wisdom, which is in the Apocrypha. And, the Apocrypha occupies a kind of awkward status within Anglicanism, where we don't normally read it to establish doctrine, right? So if you hate everything that I'm about to say right now, take comfort. You can just say, well, I'm a good Protestant Anglican. We don't read the Apocrypha to establish doctrine, so all of this is completely illegitimate. And it's nice that she's so Catholic and eccentric, but we don't need to do any of that. But I think it's helpful because it's a passage that really illuminates what would people at the time of Jesus have heard when Jesus compares himself and the bread of life, presumably the Eucharist, to manna. So the Book of Wisdom, chapter 16, verses 20 and 21 says, "You gave your people food of angels, and without their toil, you supplied them from heaven with bread ready to eat, providing every pleasure and suited to every taste. For your sustenance manifested your sweetness to your children, and the bread, ministering to the desire of the one who took it, was changed to suit everyone's liking." So what this is saying is that manna itself would change to meet the desire of each person who received it and perfectly match itself and accommodate itself to whatever their desire was. Now, this is also the understanding of manna that you're going to get in the Babylonian Talmud and in most of the church fathers, because they were reading this passage from the Book of Wisdom. And in a certain sense, this is just the theology of divine accommodation, meaning that God, being infinite, has to accommodate himself to our capacity to receive him, right? Origen of Alexandria has a lovely passage where he compares the way that God reveals himself in scripture and the sacraments to a parent or a nurse speaking baby talk to a little child so that the child can understand. But it's not just that God accommodates himself to our capacities or our abilities, but actually even to our desires, which is fascinating to me. And this is not actually just pure subjectivity where there's no objective reality anymore. It's not a miracle that God is working in each person's sense perception, but it's that the bread itself is actually changed in its substance to meet our desires. And so the fact that we experience the Eucharist differently is a feature, not a bug. But wait, you might all be thinking, no, Dr. Anderson, I've read the Bible. I've read more of the Bible than your Book of Wisdom. And I happen to know that the Israelites don't seem to have been very happy about the manna. They complained about the manna all the time. If manna is something that perfectly meets all of our desires, why in the world were they so upset about it? Well, I regret to inform you that our desires are not always great. Right? And so if what you desire is poisonous to you, manna or the Eucharist also becomes poison. And at the point in the story when the Israelites are doing so much complaining about manna, they're looking back to the days of slavery in Egypt, blinded by a kind of fuzzy nostalgia and saying, it was so much better back there. I wish that we were back in our days of slavery in Egypt. That is what they wanted with all of their heart. And then that's exactly what manna became for them, so that they were, in fact, eating the bread of slavery because that was what they thought they wanted. And I think this actually helps us to make sense of those kind of cryptic warnings in 1 Corinthians 11, where it warns people not to receive the Eucharist without discerning the body, lest they eat and drink judgment upon themselves, and says that this is why some people have died. What do we do with the fact that the Bible seems to be saying that the medicine of life can kill you? Well, again, if we hold that the Eucharist is something that will change itself to meet your own desires, if what you actually desire is something that is toxic to yourself and others, that may be what you receive. So if you accept any of this, and you may not, the Eucharist actually will become what you want it to be. So if what you want when you receive the Eucharist is sort of a comfortable nostalgia, well, that's what you're going to get. If, you're fine with a kind of bored complacency, that's what you're going to get. If it's mostly about you wanting to feel a human connection to these other people that you're in community with, that's what you'll get. And if what you want is actually a transforming encounter with the living God, that's what you'll get. But saying that the Eucharist accommodates itself to our desires, it's not the same thing as saying that the Eucharist is going to meet all of our desires, right? If we, as finite, limited creatures, can never possess God, and yet we all have an innate hunger and longing for God, then human life is actually meant to be marked by yearning, incompleteness, and lack of fulfillment, right? I'm actually going to repeat that. If all of us inherently desire God, and yet God is infinite, and we are finite creatures who can never grasp God, then human life is meant to be marked by unfulfillment, incompleteness, and yearning. This may be unfortunate to hear, right? Because all of us like to think that we can sort of be anything, have anything, do anything that we want. But this would suggest that no, actually we can't. That we are desiring creatures whose ultimate desire is for a thing that we can never possess, and which is always just out of our grasp. But that desire continues to pull us, to stretch us, to cause us to grow outside of ourselves in a Godward direction. And the reality is also that God has to work with our physical bodies, which includes our brain. And the human brain can become habituated to any experience, including the experience of God. And so, we can never actually experience the ultimate fulfillment of our desires, even in the Eucharist. And so the absence of the Eucharist, or of that feeling of God's presence, actually increases desire. And this is something that can happen naturally, right? It happens when, you no longer feel the particular synapses firing in your brain that is the feeling that you identify as the experience of God. You've become habituated to it, you no longer feel it. And this is something that happens naturally as a part of spiritual maturity. I'm not talking about the dark night of the soul. I'm talking about something far more prosaic and commonplace. And, actually when I was a baby Christian, really just baptized probably about 6 months and living at a convent, I reached a point where I was no longer feeling sort of the electrifying shock of God's presence at every single worship service. And I very dramatically told the superior of the community that I was going through the dark night of the soul. And of course, she just laughed at me, right? And was like, well, whatever's going on, I think we can safely eliminate that as a possibility because you're not that spiritually advanced yet. And she told me, Liza, the spiritual life is not all about consolation. And I was actually shocked because no one had ever said that to me before. And I kind of had assumed, as someone who was baptized an adult, that that was literally what I was signing up for, right? Was consolation. And I was like, wait a minute, what do you mean here? I think I was sold a bill of false goods. Of course, the spiritual life is about consolation. That's what this is about. But if this is something that happens naturally at a certain point in the spiritual life, I think it's the case that it can also be sort of artificially induced when the primary means by which you had experienced the presence of God is removed out of your grasp, such as happened for many of us during the pandemic. And if you have this sort of experience of spiritual desolation, spiritual aridity, that's artificially induced like that, when you're not actually spiritually prepared to receive that experience, I think that that is actually a dangerous thing for many people. And, that you had a lot of people who were plunged into spiritual crisis prematurely because they actually weren't at a point yet where they were ready to have that experience withdrawn from them, and it was withdrawn anyway. Whereas for people who were in a different place spiritually, where they were already used to the fact that like maybe they wouldn't get to feel this every single time they received communion, the experience becomes a little bit different. I'm going to say a couple more things, and the good news is I think you're actually going to get 2 chapters in this book. But I'm going to say a couple more things on this chapter, and then we'll pause for questions before I give you a whole nother set of things. One of the practices that became much more widely adopted during the pandemic was the whole idea of spiritual communion, which is introduced in the Book of Common Prayer in the rites of ministration to the sick, where it tells us to assure the person who cannot receive communion that if they really desire to, all of the benefits of the Eucharist are conveyed spiritually through their desire. Now, if I'm being totally honest, I'm not entirely sure that I believe that. But let's just say for a minute that I believe what the Book of Common Prayer says. And one thing I like about this is that it's a theology that takes desire very seriously, right? If it's saying that like your desire for communion actually is sufficient and can convey all the benefits that actually receiving communion would. My fear is that I think in the year of our Lord 2022, we may lack the kind of robust metaphysics that would render spiritual communion intelligible. We don't have a very robust notion of the spiritual, right? If I were to stand here and tell you that I think Christ was spiritually raised from the dead, you would probably all hear that as like, heretical seminary professor does not believe in the resurrection, doesn't think it actually happened. If I were to say that Christ is spiritually present in the Eucharist, you would probably hear that as like, okay, so like he's not really present in the Eucharist. She means that we just like feel him to be present. And if I say that I interpret the Bible spiritually rather than literally, you probably hear that as being like, oh, okay, so she's just making stuff up. Like she's not really taking it seriously. She's just making it mean whatever she wants. Because we've allowed the category of the spiritual to kind of slip into the category of the imaginary. As I was thinking about spiritual Eucharist during the pandemic, I took to joking, but in some ways I was only half joking, that during the pandemic, I had developed a remarkably robust practice of spiritual writing, during which I earnestly desired to write many, many books, tons of articles, all the things, none of which actually really came to incarnate existence on the page, but I wanted to write them. I know that I really, really wanted to write them. And I thought a lot about them. And, if I was impeded because we had a pandemic and I was overwhelmed and I was sad, well, that counts, right? It doesn't count. I would love to have to try to explain to a tenure and promotion committee that, it was all good because I had spiritually written many books during the period of the pandemic. But if I'm being honest with you, my very sincere practice of spiritual communion and my kind of flippant practice of spiritual writing look way too much alike for comfort. And I'm not really sure how we get beyond that, because I think for most of us in our current historical moment, really do have kind of a slippery, inchoate notion of the spiritual. But, basically nobody in the pre-modern world thought that the spiritual was less real than the material, right? It was really more real. It was most real. And the fact that things were literally true, materially true, physically true, was just a kind of reflection of the ultimate reality, which was in fact spiritual. And I'm not sure that we can make spiritual communion make any sense in a culture that has sort of like evacuated all meaning from the notion of the spiritual. The last thing I will say before pausing and seeing if we have any questions is that one thing for me that was helpful in terms of making spiritual communion not completely imaginary really was prayer before the reserved sacrament, because that was real, that was concrete. That wasn't just something that I was making up in my own head, but it really was, this belief that Christ is really present, even in the tiniest fragment of bread, which in a certain sense means that the church, which is the body of Christ, is present also. Even at a time in my life when I was completely isolated, alone in my apartment in Duluth, Minnesota, and without the physical proximity of the church. And for me, that was something that made spiritual communion a little bit more concrete, where it was tied to something real and extant in the world. So that is basically chapter 1. And I think I'm going to pause there for questions on any of that, because I threw tons at you. And then I think there'll be time to do at least a little bit of the next chapter.
Anyone raising their hand? I have a question if no one's raising their hand.
Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. So what I've found, let me turn down my, anyway, what I found so interesting about spiritual communion here, which we've done from the beginning, daily, in fact, is the whole live stream aspect of our technology that allows you to, it's kind of like the Angelus with the bells. You knew the bells were going off in your village, and you could, in a way, participate with the Angelus, the people inside, whether if you were working in the field. Now, that's not communion, but what you are able to do now, given our technology, is something that I don't think has ever been possible before, to literally have a window into another location, at the same moment, practically. And that is the framework within which spiritual communion can happen now. And that kind of, in a way, it's like you're in another room, but you just happen to be, miles away or even more. So does that technological piece inform what you're saying or not?
Yes. So this is interesting, because in some ways that's a whole nother chapter, which is not one of the ones I was going to talk about today. But one of the things that I found very interesting is that as the pandemic wore on, I found that I was not comfortable watching communion. I would regularly watch the first part of the service, the liturgy of the word, and listen to the readings in the scriptures. And then I would treat myself as a patristic era catechumen who were dismissed at that point. And it would be like, nope, the doors, turn it off, go away. And for me, and this is something that different people experience differently, but for me, it actually felt uncomfortably voyeuristic to watch other people having a very profound experience of communion with God, while I sort of sat and watched from a different location. It actually felt quasi-pornographic. And it was like, this doesn't actually feel to me like it ought to. It feels like I am on the outside looking in, watching other people have a close encounter with the living God, which I am not having. And in some ways, in some ways I had better experiences if I would walk away from the screen and just listen. The auditory was helpful. For me, the visual became somewhat uncomfortable. And this is something that I'm still working out, which is one of the reasons that I didn't bring this chapter. But, one of the developments of the pandemic that I found fascinating, did not have on my 2020 ecumenical bingo card, was sort of the renewal of the practice of ocular communion, right? Meaning looking at the consecrated host and experiencing that as a means of Eucharistic devotion. And, during the initial weeks of the pandemic, many of my Protestant clergy friends, Presbyterian, UCC, Methodist, sheepishly called up their local Anglo-Catholics or Roman Catholic friends and asked to borrow a monstrance. And it was like, I didn't call it, but I'm loving it. The great ocular communion revival of the early 21st century. I'm here for this. But it becomes an interesting question of sort of like, is ocular communion through a screen the same thing? Or is sight a form of touch? In which case it requires proximity. And this is getting into all kinds of ancient and medieval debates about vision theory and sort of like, is sight touch? To what extent is it embodied, et cetera? But I think it's an interesting question. And I have in some ways not been fully comfortable with live streamed Eucharists, even while I think that there are parts of Christian liturgy that work really, really well live streamed, including that whole first liturgy of the word section. Again, my pandemic experience was pretty bleak, so I don't want to completely valorize it, but I will say I had more access to quality sermons when I started, surfing around on YouTube and finding them than I had had at any previous point, right? And I would often spend the whole week listening to really good sermons from around the Anglican Communion on the same texts. And that was actually an amazing experience that I theoretically would have had available to me all along, but it had never occurred to me to do that. So I think there are things for which the technology works really, really well. And there are other things that I'm not entirely convinced we should try to translate to a screen.
I'm pretty sure Dr. Anderson that in the 1953 coronation, they turned the cameras down when the consecration was taking place. That wasn't to be broadcast like the rest of the sermon.
Yeah. So I didn't know that, but that would make sense to me in a kind of intuitive way that that some things are sort of intimate enough that they actually are appropriately private. And that doesn't mean secret, but it's like, no, if we actually really view this as a very intimate encounter with the presence of God, maybe that's actually not something to broadcast. Maybe it is something specifically for those who are present, which doesn't at all mean that we offer nothing to those who are absent, right? Yes, please.
Just thinking about what you said, and I experienced much what you talking about going throughout the whole language, hearing absolutely great sermons in singing places. But I was just wondering, it just popped into my head. I found something missing watching the Eucharist at the actual time that it was celebrated. And is it different to have it recorded and to go back and watch it the next? I don't know. I mean, it's just one of those things when we're talking about immediacy and intimacy. It seems to me very different to be at when it is actually happening physically out there than to go back and watch it as if it were a movie.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I had no answer for that. And it just popped up into my head.
Could you summarize that? It's harder to hear from us.
You're close.
Well, basically, we had someone sharing his own experience of Eucharist and asking the very good question of is it any different if you are physically there present, but then go back and watch it later as though you're watching a movie? Am I expressing this well enough? And I think it's a very good question. And, one of the things that I also initially started doing and then developed ambivalent feelings about is that I would listen or watch on YouTube, but sometimes just listen to the priest who baptized me in college saying daily mass, because I found it so comforting to hear his voice saying the Eucharist the way, it initially was in the early days of my baptism as a college student. And the reason this became uncomfortable is I realized that, no matter how this made me feel, what I was really doing was nostalgia, right? And nostalgia is it's an awkward sentiment for religious people because it often comes along with a certain kind of religiosity. And it's not all bad, but it can be very easy for us to mistake the feeling of nostalgia for God. Right. And it's well, no, what you are doing is returning to a very happy time in your youth and remembering fondly a particular period of your spiritual life with affection and nostalgia. But that is not actually the same as God, no matter how it makes you feel. And so that was something that, I initially started doing and then was am I okay with this? If all experiences of Christian worship form us, I think it's the case that some experiences might malform us in directions that are not particularly helpful. Question back there.
Actually, I like the question that Father Morris asked, and I reflected on it, and I realized that, in fact, what is written in our brochure when we are asked to, if we're online, we're asked to reflect on the Eucharist. I find that passage very helpful. A couple of times when I really think through it and pray that prayer, it touched me in a very special way. But of course, not every time. That leads to another question that you mentioned, and that is when we actually in the sanctuary and receive the communion, there are times I feel very touched and very close to God, but there are times I don't. So you're mentioning that.
This is what she's referring to.
Oh,
You might
excellent.
be interested.
Yes.
There's a distinction made between sacramental and spiritual there.
Okay.
You'll see.
Okay.
But you asked the question, sometimes we don't always feel that, it's not that night of the soul, but I sometimes worry that, with habits, habitually we do that. So after a while, we don't do anything anymore. So how do we deal with that, habitual negative inclination that we go to?
Yeah, good. So I think in the temptation, which I think usually should be resisted, but the temptation is normally to find some other kind of shiny spiritual object to grab onto that will give us the same spiritual high, right? So it's okay, what I really, really need is a new prayer book or a new prayer technique or fancy new prayer beads or a shiny icon or something else that will induce the same emotional state. And that will work for a while, right? But the problem is you're going to run out of things. And at a certain point, I think you actually do need to become comfortable with the fact that you may not be experiencing God, but that's often not because God is so far away, it's because God is so close, right? And it's sort of you actually can't perceive God precisely because you are so close to God. And there comes a kind of trust in that hopefully is not just taking it for granted. But I also think, okay, I think it's not a coincidence that the rise in frequent communion in the Episcopal Church, but also the Catholic Church, many other churches, happened to coincide historically with late capitalism, where human beings are defined by what they consume. And it's interesting, you know, I'm a good card-carrying Anglo-Catholic, so I should be an advocate for frequent communion. And in some ways I am, but I think it's interesting that like for pretty much 2,000 years of Christian history, you've had church leaders exhorting people to more frequent communion, and most people being very reticent about that, precisely because they took communion so seriously. And frequent communion only actually really skyrocketed at the time when consumption of all kinds came to the fore. And when we started really understanding human identities in terms of the things that we consume. And I remember reading something before the pandemic that talked about how, you know, the great danger was that as Christians who practice communion under the regime of late capitalism, is that we will come to define our Christian identity in terms of what we consume. And I've thought about that actually in terms of the centrality of the Eucharist to many people's identities, which is good, right? Maybe. But the thing is, you can love something without needing to possess it, right? And this is good. This may not be answering your question, but it's really helpful because it's allowing me to basically talk about the second chapter of the book that I'm not going to be able to really talk to you about. But what I think is interesting is that historically, most Eucharistic liturgies began in the bakery, if not in the field. And they were as much about the production of the Eucharist as about the consumption of it. And so I found it very, very interesting that when the pandemic hit, all of our churches, for the most part, and this was my concern also, became very preoccupied with the question of like, how do we get the consecrated elements into the hands of the people without necessarily asking that wider question of how is it that the laity, in fact, contribute to the Eucharist as such. And, you know, we still have kind of a parody of this almost in the offertory when lay people bring the bread and wine up to the altar to be consecrated. But, you know, in the vast majority of cases, we didn't make that. We bought it from the internet, right? And we have no idea where it came from. Whereas normally the pattern that we would have had here is that the reason that it's bread and wine specifically is that those are elements that it takes human labor to produce. So they've already undergone their first transformation before they ever make it up to the altar. And this is the human priestly vocation, actually, to take the material elements of creation and give them meaning, orientation, direction, to make things with them like bread and wine, and then to bring them to the altar of God where they undergo a second transformation. But instead, even pre-pandemic, what we often have is just sort of like, we bought this from the internet, we have no idea where it came from, but we now want you to make it magic. And there's a kind of passivity that is implied in that. And, you know, one of the obvious things that could be done here, but it's not actually easy, is for congregations to start making their own bread and sometimes wine. But I will tell you that I was in a congregation that thought we were going to make our own Eucharistic wine. We had a whole program about it. We had like a lot of great speaker series on the process of fermentation and its analogy to the spiritual life, et cetera. We made really bad wine. We made really bad wine. It turns out that that's actually a skill. It is not easy. You know, I have also been in communities that have made their own bread. And I actually think that there's a lot of spiritual benefit to this, but I've also been in some communities that have made some pretty terrible bread because largely, I don't know, maybe people really got into their bread baking during the pandemic and now there's like some quality loaves going on out there. But many of us have lived in a society where like bread comes from the store and we have, you know, forgotten the skill set that's involved in actually making something and offering it to God rather than just sort of like moving words around on a Word doc or numbers around on a spreadsheet. You know, a lot of us, I think, have lost that very sort of concrete embodied, here's a thing that I have made that I am offering to the glory of God.
1 minute, please.
1 minute. Are there any very last questions that we want to sort of wrap this up with? Nobody wants to have the last word. Well, it really has been a joy to be with you in this space and to try to think through some of these things. There's a lot more to it than that. At this point, I have a selection of sort of like 7 or 8 essays that are sort of coming together around this theme. But I guess maybe like my last word would be that I think we often expend too much of our Eucharistic thought and energy in the Episcopal Church around the twin questions of sort of like, can you give communion to the unbaptized and can you consecrate the Eucharist through a screen? And I actually don't think those are very spiritually interesting questions. And so part of what I'm hoping to do in this project is just expand the field of our vision onto other questions. If the Eucharist is as central in our piety and our life of faith as the energy around those 2 other dates would imply, how do we start to think of the Eucharist in other ways and really explain its centrality and its focus in our faith? So thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to make our way to our Feast of All Saints. We're just celebrating this Sunday. And, we have this act of spiritual communion prayer right here, which is interesting enough. And all the very best. See you next week.
Thank you.